Welcome. This is David Bowles, Human Meme. Today's topic, Letter to Bob Lefsetz. I am a big fan of Bob Lefsetz and his Lefsetz Letter subscription emails. Bob is a super genius. He takes on the music business. He fights with Taylor Swift and wins. She even wrote a song about hating him. So Bob is tops in my book. And in Bob's letters, he reveals the political levers of power, and he fights all the BS that spews forth in the world with great wisdom and divinity. And my human meme friend, Bob Lefsetz, also happens to be Jewish, and he reminds me of my dearly departed Columbia University mentor, Dr. Howard Stein, also a super genius, super Jew. And if you're a fan of this Human Meme podcast, you understand those descriptors are terms of endearment and not a negative affliction. And in some ways, I started this entire Human Meme podcast endeavor 4 years ago, in the footfalls of the important work of Dr. Howard Stein and Bob Lefsetz. We all share the same goal, working hard to perpetuate goodness and life back into the world. And as one Human Meme podcast listener recently said on Twitter, this Human Meme podcast is about mindfulness with an edge. Well, as it comes to every super genius endeavor, you agree with your God until you don't. And last week, as often happens, that moment arrived for me when my beloved Bob Lefsetz went too far. The problem missive arrived in my inbox with a rant from Bob titled The Deaf Installer. And right there, with that title, I knew we were in trouble as a community of friends and minds. I have dedicated most of my adult life to the deaf community and to teaching American Sign Language and perpetuating ASL in the mainstream world. And my wife, Jana, who happens to be deaf, is my book co-author, and she is also the head of the ASL program at New York University. And together we've written 5 major books about American Sign Language. And so I admit I have a deep dog in the fight when it comes to deafness and discrimination and cultural raising for emotional entertainment. And Bob's The Deaf Installer email was more of the most. Bob picks a topic, complains about it, then he tells us why the common thinking is wrong, and he sets us right, and the world is ready to kindly spin for another day. But this time, it was different. Bob was purposefully meaner, crueler. He had a sharpness without an edge. In that Deaf Installer email, Bob was telling us a story about a deaf file cabinet installer hired via Amazon. And this deaf guy messed up a delivery by cracking the front of the cabinet during the installation process. Now that's a fine idea for a topic. A bad installer gone bad. But Bob, unfortunately, took the storyline approach that the problem with the installer was his deafness and not just the fact that he was a bad installer. And yes, we as readers know what I just said is true, because the title of Bob's piece was The Deaf Installer, not The Bad Installer. Bob goes on to tell us about the hammer the deaf installer dropped on the floor that may have left a mark. And Bob has no idea how the deaf installer will communicate with his boss because of his deafness. And it's quite clear the point Bob was trying to make was that the deaf installer was at fault because of his deafness and his inability to effectively communicate with Bob and Bob's bad shoulder and Bob's bad back. And if that was not the case, then Bob would have just told the story of an installer who just happened to be deaf and who just happened to mess up his cabinet. Or maybe Bob might have not even mentioned that the installer was deaf at all. Hey, deaf people have the right to be just as bad a cabinet installer as a hearing person. But no. Bob led with the disability, named his email after the disability, suggesting without saying it that the disability was at fault. And that, my human meme friend, is just wrong. And if there's anyone who might believe, who you might think might just be sensitive to the disabled, one would reason that person would be Bob Lefsetz. We know Bob has had many surgeries. Bob has a bad shoulder. Bob has leukemia. Bob has a rare skin condition that has confounded dermatologists all over America. We, the loyal Lefsetz Letter readers, have heard all about those Lefsetz maladies for weeks upon year over century. And you think if there's anybody in the world, anybody who might be sensitive to the discrimination and to the cruelty that the disabled, the wounded, the damaged, the deaf people experience every day in the mainstream world, you just might think Bob Lefsetz would be that sort of natural, disabled advocate and not make himself an enemy of the deaf. If there's anyone who is clever enough and sensitive enough and smart enough to communicate in text or in gesture or in mime with a deaf person, you know that person you would name would be Bob Lefsetz. But no. Bob instead chose to write to us with this horrible story of the deaf installer, who just happened to crack his cabinet, and who just happened to trigger Bob's OCD. And so, my human meme friend, in closing, allow me this moment to speak directly to my virtual friend and ethereal mentor, Bob Lefsetz. Bob, when you are a leader of minds, as you are, and when you are a facilitator of the human spirit, as you are required that you must also be that dutiful exception. In every sense and in every syllable, even if you've been offended and dismayed along the way, and you do this moral due diligence willingly, because we, the rest of us, look up to you to find the way out. And we want to learn from your example. And we must know how to take the next evolutionary step in understanding everyone. And we want to find a way how to forgive, while never discriminating or demeaning. We need to find our way back into a world that spins with reliability, predictability, with kindness to all. And that way forward is named Bob Lefsetz. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.